Burkina Faso can own the gold beneath its soil. Its miners can bring that gold out of the ground. But if material that still contains valuable gold must leave the country before the remaining metal can be recovered, who really controls the final value? That question sits at the heart of a remarkable change now unfolding in Burkina Faso. For years, certain residues from the country's gold industry had to be sent abroad for specialized processing. Burkina Faso could mine the resource, but it did not directly control every stage involved in determining and recovering the precious metals still trapped inside that material. This is not simply an African problem. The United States still deals with abandoned hard rock mines and contaminated mining sites. Canada faces enormous liabilities left behind by old mines. Around the world, governments are discovering that yesterday's mining waste can remain tomorrow's environmental problem, and in some cases, tomorrow's valuable resource. But Burkina Faso faced another question. What if some of that material could be processed at home? That is where Golden Hand enters the story. In Ouagadougou, a Burkinabe company is processing mining residues using machinery that official sources say was designed and manufactured inside Burkina Faso. President Ibrahim Traore has presented that achievement as something larger than an industrial project. To him, it represents another step toward taking greater control of the country's resources, technology, and economic future. And then came the evidence people could actually see. Mining residue connected to the controversial Chabonfin affair was eventually processed inside Burkina Faso. From part of that material came 44 gold bars weighing roughly 205 pounds in total, gold that was handed to the state for the National Reserve. So this story is no longer only about promises. It is about who controls technology, who captures value, and whether an African resource producer can move further up its own industrial chain. If you want Africa's changing economic story examined through the numbers, the money, and the power behind the headlines, follow this channel. Because what Burkina Faso wants to do next may be even more important than those 44 bars of gold. The story of Chabonfin begins with something that looks almost worthless. In industrial gold processing, activated carbon is used to capture gold. Over time, some of that carbon breaks into extremely small particles. These fine particles can become mining residue, but residue does not necessarily mean worthless waste. It can still contain recoverable gold and silver. For Burkina Faso, that created a difficult problem. The country had a major gold industry, yet it lacked part of the specialized capacity needed to process certain residues at home. Material containing potential value could therefore be shipped abroad for treatment. Then, in 2018, the issue exploded into public controversy. A shipment of Chabonfin connected to the Essakane gold mine was stopped before leaving Burkina Faso. Questions followed about what the material contained, how much precious metal could ultimately be recovered from it, and how the state could properly protect its economic interests. The dispute became a national issue and eventually reached the courts. But this story should not be simplified into a claim that somebody was proven to have stolen Burkina Faso's gold. The legal and technical dispute was more complicated than that. What mattered for the larger national debate was the weakness the affair exposed. Burkina Faso was producing the resource, while an important step in recovering value from certain residues depended on processing outside the country. By late 2023, the state and IAM-Gold Essakane reached an agreement that brought the long-running dispute toward its conclusion. The company agreed to pay the state 9 billion CFA francs, roughly $16 million, and the disputed material was transferred to Burkina Faso. That could have been the end of the story. Instead, it created a new question. The state now controlled hundreds of tons of material that has spent years at the center of a national controversy. Where would it go for processing? This time, the answer would not be Canada or another foreign destination. The material would remain in Burkina Faso, and a company called Golden Hand was waiting to process it. Mining waste is not a problem unique to Burkina Faso or even to Africa. The United States knows this firsthand. Across the country, Abandoned hard rock mines have left behind contaminated water, unstable waste, and environmental liabilities that can survive long after the mining jobs disappear. The Environmental Protection Agency still oversees abandoned mine and mineral processing sites through federal cleanup programs. American authorities are even examining whether some old mine waste can become a new source of critical minerals. Canada offers an even more dramatic example. At the former giant gold mine near Yellowknife, roughly 522 million pounds of toxic arsenic trioxide dust remain underground. Managing that legacy is not a problem measured in months or years. It requires a long-term strategy designed to prevent contamination for generations. And then there is Brazil. In 2019, the collapse of a mining tailings dam at Brumadinho released a devastating wave of waste. 272 people were killed. The disaster became an international warning about what can happen when mining residues are not safely managed. These examples reveal an important distinction. Mining waste can represent an environmental liability, but certain residues can also contain metals that still have economic value. The challenge is knowing what remains, recovering it economically, and safely managing whatever is left afterward. That brings us back to Burkina Faso. Its problem was not simply that mining created waste. Every major mining country faces that problem. The deeper issue was that some residues containing recoverable precious metals had to leave Burkina Faso for specialized processing. That meant another stage of the value chain took place beyond the country's borders. So the question raised by the Chabonfin affair was bigger than one disputed shipment. If valuable material remains after the first stage of gold production, should an African country simply accept that the technology needed to recover that value must exist somewhere else? Burkina Faso decided to test another answer. Instead of treating foreign processing capacity as permanent, it would try to build that missing capability at home. And Golden Hand became the test. Golden Hand officially began operations in January 2024 inches the Kosodo industrial area of Ouagadougou. But what makes the company important to this story is not simply the opening of another factory. It represents an attempt to fill a missing link in Burkina Faso's gold industry. Golden Hand was established to process several kinds of mining residues, including fine carbon, concentrates, slag, and ash from industrial mining operations. These materials may still contain precious metals that can potentially be recovered instead of allowing their remaining value to go unused or requiring specialized treatment abroad. The ownership structure is also significant. The government of Burkina Faso holds 40% of Golden Hand, while the remaining 60% is held by Burkinabe private interests. In other words, this is not simply a government operation. It combines state participation with domestic private capital. Then there is the technology. Burkinabe authorities say the processing machinery was designed and manufactured inside Burkina Faso. Ibrahim Traore emphasized that these were not foreign machines purchased overseas and merely assembled in Ouagadougou. He praised the ingenuity of Burkinabe engineers and argued that the country should support people capable of developing technology at home. Traore went even further, saying Burkina Faso had become the second African country to develop this particular technology. That statement needs an important qualification. It is Traore's claim. There is not yet sufficient independent international evidence to present that ranking as an established fact. But the larger point does not depend on the ranking. A country that once lacked this particular processing capability now has equipment operating on its own territory that official sources say was designed and built locally. That changes the question from whether Burkina Faso possesses gold to whether it can possess more of the knowledge and industrial capability surrounding that gold. And Golden Hand soon received an extraordinary test. Instead of demonstrating its machines only with ordinary commercial material, the company would process the very mining residue that had spent years at the center of the Chabonfin controversy. What came out of that material would give Burkina Faso something far more persuasive than another speech about sovereignty. The strongest evidence for Golden Hand did not come from a political speech. It came in the form of 44 gold bars. After the Chabonfin settlement, roughly 447 metric tons of disputed mining residue were transferred to the Burkinabe state and sent to Golden Hand for domestic processing. For an American audience, that is close to 985,000 pounds of material. By December 2024, Golden Hand had processed about 142 metric tons, or approximately 314,000 pounds. That was only about 1/3 of the material delivered for treatment. Yet from that first portion came something remarkable. 44 bars of gold weighing a combined 93.197 kilograms, or roughly 205 pounds. The gold was handed over to the government and designated for Burkina Faso's National Gold Reserve. Think about the symbolism of that sequence. Material that had spent years at the center of a national controversy over foreign processing was now being treated inside Burkina Faso. And instead of leaving the country for another stage of recovery, the resulting gold was being transferred directly into national reserves. But the numbers also require caution. We cannot simply take the first 205 pounds of recovered gold and assume that the remaining material will produce gold at exactly the same rates. Mining residues are not necessarily uniform, and the publicly available results do not justify that kind of projection. Nor do 44 bars prove that Golden Hand has already solved every technical, financial, or environmental challenge involved in processing mining residues. What they do prove is narrower, but still important. Burkina Faso now has demonstrated domestic capacity to recover a measurable amount of gold from material linked to the Chabonfin affair. That turns an abstract argument about sovereignty into something people can see and weigh. For Ibrahim Traore, however, the significance goes beyond those 205 pounds of gold. Golden Hand fits into a much broader effort to change what happens to Burkina Faso's mineral wealth after it comes out of the ground. And that larger strategy is where this story becomes political. For Ibrahim Traore, Golden Hand is not simply about recovering more gold from mining residue. It fits into a much larger question. How much of the value created by Burkina Faso's natural resources should remain under Burkinabe control? That distinction matters. Traore's strategy is not merely to increase the amount of gold coming out of the ground. His government has been trying to bring more stages of the mineral value chain inside the country. Golden Hand represents one stage by processing mining residues domestically. A national gold refinery represents another. Burkina Faso launched a refinery project intended to process more of its gold at home, rather than allowing refining to remain another stage performed elsewhere. Then comes ownership and state participation. Under Burkina Faso's 2024 mining reforms, the government increased its role in the sector. The state has also expanded the activities of its national mining company and established a national gold reserve. Seen together, these policies reveal the larger idea. Mining the resource is only the beginning. Processing it, refining it, developing the technical knowledge around it, collecting revenue from it, and deciding how the resulting wealth is used are also parts of resource sovereignty. Traore has repeatedly emphasized Burkinabe engineers in this vision. At Golden Hand, he praised the fact that the machinery was developed locally and encouraged inventors to believe that the state would support domestic innovation. But Traore should not be credited with inventing Golden Hand itself. The project had been developing for years before he came to power. His role has been different. Under his leadership, Golden Hand became closely aligned with a broader government strategy centered on national control of resources and domestic processing. That is why the factory carries political significance beyond its current production numbers. For Traore, the question is no longer simply who digs Burkina Faso's gold out of the ground. It is who owns the technology, who performs the processing, who receives the revenue, and ultimately who controls the value after that gold has been mined. Golden Hand becomes more important when the discussion moves from political ideas to ordinary economic benefits. When the plant began operating, it employed 174 workers. More recent figures, published by Golden Hand, report 186 permanent jobs and another 120 non-permanent positions. That brings the reported workforce to 306 people, including 139 women and 167 men. For a country trying to capture more value from its mineral resources, those jobs matter because they are connected to an activity that previously depended partly on processing capacity outside Burkina Faso. There is also a financial ambition. When the project was launched, Golden Hand was expected to generate annual revenue of about 2 billion CFA francs during its first 3 years. That is approximately 3.6 million United States dollars at a recent exchange rate. But that number requires caution. It was a forecast, not proof of audited annual revenue. The stronger evidence remains what Golden Hand has physically processed and produced. Yet Ibrahim Traore wants the project to go much further. When he visited the facility, he did not limit his message to Burkina Faso. He invited countries across West Africa and Central Africa to bring their mining residues to Burkina Faso for treatment. Consider how significant that ambition would be if it works. For years, Burkina Faso had to send certain valuable mining residues abroad because the necessary processing capability was missing at home. Now, Traore is proposing the opposite flow. Instead of Burkinabe material searching for technology abroad, material from neighboring African countries could eventually come to Burkina Faso because the technology is available there. That would transform Golden Hand from a national sovereignty project into a regional industrial service. But this remains an ambition, not an accomplished regional system. There is not yet sufficient evidence that large volumes of mining residue from multiple African countries are already flowing into Burkina Faso. The distinction matters. Burkina Faso has demonstrated that domestic processing is possible. The next challenge is proving that it can be competitive, reliable, environmentally responsible, and large enough to serve others. If it can, the country will have done something more consequential than keeping one shipment at home. It will have begun turning a former dependency into something Burkina Faso can potentially sell as a capability. The larger African question is whether Golden Hand can become more than a successful Burkinabe experiment. Africa possesses extraordinary mineral wealth, yet possessing resources and capturing their value are two very different things. Recent United Nations analysis has emphasized this gap, estimating that Africa holds roughly 30% of the world's critical mineral reserves, while capturing less than 5% of the associated value added. That imbalance explains why the Golden Hand story matters beyond Burkina Faso. The lesson is not that Mali, Niger, or every other African country should build an identical processing plant that could create expensive facilities without enough material to operate efficiently. A more practical possibility is regional specialization. One African country might develop expertise in processing a particular mining residue. Another might specialize in refining. Others could provide energy, transportation, engineering, or manufacturing. Instead of every country trying to reproduce an entire industrial chain, neighboring economies could build part of that chain together. That is where Traore's invitation to West African and Central African countries becomes interesting. If Golden Hand can process material competitively for neighboring states, Burkina Faso would not merely be keeping more value at home. It could help keep another stage of mineral processing within Africa. But 4 conditions will determine whether that ambition becomes reality. The technology must work reliably at larger scale. Processing costs must compete with foreign alternatives. Environmental controls must safely manage whatever remains after valuable metals are recovered. And customers must trust the result enough to send valuable material across borders. None of those outcomes should be assumed. Golden Hand is still young, and available evidence does not show that it has already become a major regional processing center. But its underlying principle is worth watching. Natural resources alone do not guarantee prosperity. Technical capability, skilled workers, infrastructure, reliable institutions, and the ability to transform raw resources into higher value products matter just as much. For African countries, that may be the deeper Pan-African lesson. The goal does not have to be economic isolation. It can instead be African resources moving through more African technology, African businesses, and regional supply chains before their final value leaves the continent. Burkina Faso's push for greater control over its mineral wealth has also created concern outside the country, but it is important to describe that reaction accurately. There is little evidence that Western governments or investors specifically opposed Golden Hand because Burkina Faso began processing mining residues at home. The stronger concerns have focused on Traore's broader mining policies. Those concerns became visible in 2024 after Traore discussed withdrawing some foreign mining permits and increasing national control over gold production. Shares of several foreign mining companies operating in Burkina Faso fell. Fortuna Mining and Horizon Gold dropped about 9%, while Endeavour Mining declined roughly 3%. Investors were reacting to uncertainty. Mining projects can require enormous amounts of capital and many years before investors recover their money. If governments change ownership rules, taxes, royalties, or permits unexpectedly, companies may demand higher returns or invest somewhere else. The International Monetary Fund has raised a similar concern about Burkina Faso's 2024 mining reforms. The state's free ownership interest in mining projects increased from 10% to 15%. Gold royalties can also rise to 7% when prices exceed specified levels. The fund warned that combining higher state participation with a heavier fiscal burden could make new mining investments less attractive. That argument deserves to be taken seriously. But it does not automatically mean Burkina Faso is wrong to pursue more domestic processing. International institutions themselves increasingly argue that African countries need to capture more value from their minerals through processing, industrialization, skills, and regional supply chains. So the real debate is not simply Africa against the West. Burkina Faso has a legitimate interest in retaining more value from resources produced on its territory. Investors also have a legitimate interest in predictable laws, enforceable agreements, and projects capable of earning a return. The difficult question is whether both goals can coexist. If Burkina Faso increases domestic capability while maintaining transparent rules and competitive investment conditions, greater sovereignty does not have to mean economic isolation. But if sovereignty becomes unpredictable regulation, inefficient state ownership, or weak accountability, the cost could eventually fall on Burkina Faso itself. That is the test Traore's mining strategy still has to pass. The story began with a troubling question. Why should material containing Burkina Faso's remaining gold value have to leave the country before that value could be recovered? Today, Golden Hand provides at least part of an answer. It has not solved every problem in Burkina Faso's mining industry. It has not yet proven that it can become a major processing center for an entire region. But it has demonstrated something tangible. Material connected to the Chabonfin controversy was processed on Burkinabe soil, and 44 gold bars weighing roughly 205 pounds were recovered and delivered for the National Gold Reserve. That is why the significance goes beyond 44 bars. Under Ibrahim Traore, Burkina Faso is attempting to connect domestic processing with refining, engineering, state participation, and national reserves. The objective is not simply to possess mineral resources underground, but to control more of the value created after those resources are extracted. That lesson reaches beyond Burkina Faso. Across West Africa and the wider Sahel, Mali under Assimi Goïta and Niger under Abdourahmane Tiani are also debating how African states can gain more from their natural resources. The question will increasingly matter to the African Union and to anyone following African news. It will also shape future relationships with France, other Western countries, China, and new international partners. But sovereignty alone is not enough. Without skilled workers, competitive technology, transparent management, predictable laws, and responsible environmental controls, keeping an industrial process at home can become expensive rather than empowering. That may be Golden Hand's most useful Pan-African lesson. A country should not ask only how much gold, uranium, copper, or other wealth lies beneath its soil. It should ask how many stages of the value chain its people can perform competitively and responsibly. Burkina Faso is testing that idea in the real world. Whether the model succeeds over the long term remains an open question. But what began with Chabonfin has become something much larger. An experiment in whether an African resource producer can turn dependence on outside processing into domestic capability. What should come first? Owning the resource, mastering the technology, or controlling the processing? Share your view and follow the channel as we continue examining who is really gaining power from the economic changes reshaping Africa. We sincerely appreciate your time and support. Every video on this channel is carefully researched, thoughtfully written, and meticulously edited by our dedicated team. We don't rely on automated production or shortcuts to create our content. Every story, every visual, and every detail is crafted with genuine care, passion, and a commitment to bringing you meaningful, high-quality videos.